The studio apartment had become my world for the past 4 years. A cramped space where canvases leaned against every wall and the smell of oil paint had permanently soaked into the floorboards. To my family, it was evidence of my failure to launch into real adulthood. To me, it was where I'd been quietly building something they couldn't understand. "Maya, you're 29 years old," my sister Rebecca would remind me during her monthly check-in calls, her voice carrying that particular tone of concerned superiority that successful older siblings perfect over the years. "At some point, you need to accept that art isn't going to pay your bills." Rebecca had followed the family template perfectly. Business degree, corporate job, suburban house, 2 kids and a retirement fund. She was everything my parents had hoped both their daughters would become. I was the cautionary tale they used to motivate their friends' children. The irony was that I'd been supporting myself through art for 3 years. Not through painting sales, those were still rare and modest, but through restoration work for private collectors, authentication consulting for auction houses, and technical analysis for insurance companies investigating art fraud. It was steady, well-paying work that required the same skills I used in my own artistic practice, but explaining this to my family felt impossible when they'd already decided my path was impractical. The breakthrough had come 18 months earlier when Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, the chief curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, had visited a small gallery where 3 of my paintings were displayed. She'd spent 40 minutes studying my work, then tracked down my contact information through the gallery owner. "Your technique is extraordinary," she'd said during our first phone conversation. "There's something happening in your brushwork that reminds me of the late Rothko pieces, but with a contemporary emotional complexity that's entirely your own. I'd like to discuss a potential acquisition for our modern collection." That conversation had led to 6 months of meetings, studio visits and careful negotiation. The Met wanted to purchase not just one piece, but a series of 5 paintings I'd completed over 2 years. Works that explored themes of urban isolation and digital disconnection through layers of color and texture that seemed to shift depending on the lighting and viewing angle. But I hadn't told my family about any of it. How could I explain that the Metropolitan Museum of Art was interested in my work when they'd spent years treating my painting as an expensive hobby that prevented me from finding real employment? How do you announce that your art is being considered for permanent acquisition when your sister regularly suggests you apply for administrative assistant positions? The silence had become a habit, a protective barrier against the well-meaning criticism that had eroded my confidence for years. It was easier to let them worry about my impractical choices than to risk having them dismiss achievements they wouldn't understand or believe. The acquisition had been finalized 6 months ago, but the Met's exhibition schedule meant the paintings wouldn't be displayed until their upcoming Contemporary Visions showcase. In the meantime, I'd signed with a prestigious gallery in Chelsea, sold 8 pieces to private collectors for amounts that would have shocked my family, and been featured in Art News as one of 30 artists under 30 changing contemporary painting. But at family gatherings I remained Maya who played with paints, and needed to consider more practical career options. This Sunday's extended family dinner at my Aunt Karen's house had followed the predictable script. Rebecca had updated everyone on her promotion to regional sales director, her husband's new position at a tech startup, and their plans to renovate their kitchen. I'd listened politely, contributed appropriately, and deflected questions about my own life with vague references to staying busy with projects. "Projects," Rebecca had repeated with that familiar mix of affection and exasperation. "Maya, we're all adults here. You can call them paintings. We know you're still trying to make this art thing work." Aunt Karen, my mother's younger sister and a retired high school guidance counselor, had nodded knowingly. "There's no shame in having creative hobbies, Maya, but at your age you need to think about building something sustainable. Maybe teaching? Art teachers have good benefits." I'd practiced this conversation so many times in my head that my responses had become automatic. "You're probably right," I'd say, or, "I've been thinking about that too." Anything to avoid the exhausting process of explaining a career they'd already decided was unsustainable. The suggestion about teaching wasn't new. It surfaced at every family gathering along with ideas about graphic design, more commercial, art therapy, helping people, or museum work, at least it's art-related. What they didn't understand was that I was already doing exactly what I wanted to do, and it was working better than any of us had imagined. My cousin Jessica, Rebecca's 17-year-old daughter, had been scrolling through her phone during most of the dinner conversation, occasionally rolling her eyes at the adult discussions about careers and mortgages and retirement planning. But when the subject turned to my impractical art career, she'd looked up with sudden interest. "Aunt Maya, Didn't you say you were working on something big? She'd asked, her teenage directness cutting through the diplomatic adult conversation. Like something with a museum? I'd felt the familiar tightening in my chest that came whenever someone asked direct questions about my work. Just some consultation stuff, I'd said, hoping to redirect the conversation away from specifics. But Jessica had pressed on with the persistence of someone who hadn't yet learned to avoid uncomfortable topics. But I thought you said it was the Met? That's like a really big deal, right? The table had gone quiet in the way that happens when someone mentions something unexpected. Rebecca had looked at me with a confused expression, as if trying to reconcile this information with her understanding of my failing art career. The Metropolitan Museum? Aunt Karen had asked, her guidance counselor instincts engaging. Maya, what kind of consultation work are you doing there? I'd felt trapped between my habitual deflection and Jessica's obvious expectation of a real answer. Just some technical analysis work, I'd said, which was technically true if you considered authenticity verification and condition assessment as technical analysis. But Jessica hadn't been satisfied with vague explanations. Didn't they buy some of your paintings, though? I remember you mentioning that. The admission had hung in the air like smoke. Rebecca's fork had frozen halfway to her mouth, and I could see her processing this information against everything she thought she knew about my financial situation and career prospects. The Met bought your work? Rebecca had asked, her voice carrying a note of disbelief that stung more than she probably intended. It's not as significant as it sounds, I'd said, falling back on the minimization that had become second nature. They acquire lots of contemporary pieces. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. But even as I'd said it, I'd known how hollow the deflection sounded. The Metropolitan Museum of Art doesn't acquire work casually, and everyone at the table knew it. The conversation had moved on to safer topics after that, but I'd felt the weight of unasked questions and unexplored implications. Rebecca had kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, confusion mixed with what might have been the beginning of reassessment. That's when Rebecca had launched into her familiar lecture about practical career choices, apparently feeling the need to reassert the established family narrative about my impractical life decisions. Stop wasting time on art projects, she'd announced to the table, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been successful in traditional ways. Maya needs to start thinking seriously about building a real career. She's talented, but talent doesn't pay the bills. Aunt Karen had nodded emphatically, her years of counseling teenagers about realistic career expectations clearly influencing her perspective. She needs practical skills. Something with steady income and benefits. Art can be a wonderful hobby, but it's not a sustainable career for most people. The conversation had felt like a summary judgment on 4 years of work they'd never really tried to understand. I'd looked around the table at faces filled with genuine concern and misplaced certainty, and I'd felt the familiar resignation that came with these family interventions. You're right, I'd said simply, because it was easier than defending work they'd already decided was worthless. But Jessica had been scrolling through her phone again, and her sharp intake of breath had cut through the adult conversation about my questionable life choices. Oh my God, she'd said, her voice carrying the excitement that only teenagers can muster for unexpected discoveries. Aunt Maya, isn't this you? She turned her phone toward the table, and I'd seen my own face looking back at me from what appeared to be a news article. The headline read, Contemporary Visions. Metropolitan Museum opens major exhibition featuring rising artists. The photo showed me standing next to one of my paintings in the Met's contemporary wing, wearing the black dress I'd bought specifically for the opening reception 3 days earlier. Behind me, a small crowd of art world professionals examined my work with the serious attention that museum exhibitions command. Rebecca had taken Jessica's phone with trembling hands, scrolling through the article with an expression of growing shock. Maya Rachel Thompson, 29, is one of 15 artists featured in the Metropolitan Museum's Contemporary Visions exhibition, which opened this week to critical acclaim, she'd read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed had been different from the usual uncomfortable pauses in our family conversations. This wasn't the silence of people avoiding difficult topics. It was the silence of people processing information that completely contradicted everything they thought they knew. Aunt Karen had leaned over to see the phone screen, her expression shifting from confusion to something approaching awe. Maya, this says the exhibition runs for 6 months and features work from emerging artists who are reshaping contemporary painting. It calls your pieces haunting meditations on modern isolation with technical mastery reminiscent of the abstract expressionist masters. The words hung in the air like physical objects. Rebecca had continued scrolling, finding more details about the exhibition, about my work, about the significance of being selected for display at one of the world's most prestigious museums. There's another article here, she'd said, her voice still quiet with shock. From Art News. Thompson's 5P series explores themes of digital disconnection through layered oil techniques that create an almost holographic depth, with colors that seem to shift and breathe as viewers move through the gallery space. Jessica had grabbed her phone back, her teenage excitement overriding the adult shock at the table. Aunt Maya, this is so cool. It says here that your paintings are being compared to Rothko and that collectors are already inquiring about commissioning new works. You're like famous. The assessment was generous, but the attention was real. The opening reception had been attended by museum directors, gallery owners, art critics, and collectors from around the world. Sales inquiries had been coming through my gallery representative daily. 3 art magazines wanted to do profile pieces, and a documentary filmmaker was interested in including my work in a project about contemporary American painting. But sitting at my aunt's dining room table, surrounded by family members who'd spent years encouraging me to pursue more practical career paths, the success felt surreal and disconnected from the person they thought I was. Rebecca had set down the phone and looked at me directly for the first time in the conversation. Maya, I don't understand. If this is what you've been working on, why didn't you tell us? Why have you been letting us lecture you about getting a real job when you're having exhibitions at the Metropolitan Museum of Art? It was a fair question that I'd been avoiding for months. How do you explain that their well-meaning concern had become so predictable and dismissive that sharing good news felt pointless? How do you tell people who love you that their support had become indistinguishable from their criticism? When would I have told you? I'd asked quietly. During the conversations about how art isn't a real career? Or when you were suggesting I consider teaching or graphic design because painting wasn't practical? The question had landed heavily. Rebecca's face had flushed, and I could see her processing years of conversations from a completely different perspective. Uncle Paul, Aunt Karen's husband, had spoken for the first time since Jessica's discovery. Maya, help me understand something. This exhibition at the Met. This isn't just displaying your work, is it? This is a major career achievement. I'd nodded slowly. It's considered quite significant in the art world. The Contemporary Visions exhibition only happens every 5 years, and they typically select artists who they believe will have lasting influence on contemporary painting. The explanation had felt strange coming out of my mouth at a family dinner. For so long, I'd compartmentalized my professional achievements from my family relationships that connecting them felt almost foreign. Aunt Karen had shaken her head slowly, her expression mixing regret with confusion. Maya, I feel like we need to apologize. We've been treating your career like a hobby for years, haven't we? The acknowledgement had been both healing and painful. Healing because it recognized the dismissal I'd experienced. Painful because it highlighted how completely they'd misunderstood the work that had consumed my life for 4 years. My phone had buzzed with a text message and I'd glanced at it automatically. The message was from Dr. Hartley at the Met. Maya, wonderful coverage in the Times today. The response to your pieces has been extraordinary. Would you be available for a call tomorrow about our next acquisition discussion? Rebecca had seen me reading the message. Maya, can I ask, and please don't take this the wrong way, but are you making a living from this? I mean, can you support yourself through art sales and museum work? It was the question that had been underlying all their concern for years. The assumption that artistic success and financial stability were mutually exclusive, that pursuing creative work necessarily meant choosing poverty and instability. The Met acquisition was for a significant amount, I'd said carefully, and the gallery representation has led to consistent sales to private collectors. I've been financially stable for about 3 years now. The admission had felt like opening a door that had been closed for so long I'd almost forgotten it existed. For 3 years I'd been supporting myself comfortably through my art while letting my family believe I was struggling and impractical. Jessica had been reading more coverage on her phone, her excitement growing with each new discovery. Aunt Maya, there's a whole article in Vogue about the exhibition. They interviewed you about your painting process and your influences. You talked about growing up feeling disconnected and how that influences your work. She'd scrolled further, finding more coverage. And look, this gallery website shows your paintings selling for like real money. These aren't like hundreds of dollars. These are thousands. The numbers had made Rebecca go very still. As someone who worked in sales, she understood exactly what consistent 5-figure art sales meant in terms of annual income and career sustainability. Maya, she'd said slowly, I think I owe you a very significant apology. We've been approaching your career from a place of complete ignorance, haven't we? The apology had meant everything and nothing simultaneously. Everything because it acknowledged years of dismissed dreams and unrecognized achievement. Nothing because the work itself hadn't changed, only their perception of its value. Uncle Paul had cleared his throat. Maya, I have to ask, when you've been sitting here listening to us give you advice about finding practical work, what has that been like for you? It was perhaps the most direct question anyone had asked me about the family dynamics that had shaped years of gatherings. Exhausting, I'd answered honestly. It's exhausting to have work you care deeply about consistently dismissed as impractical, especially when that work is actually succeeding in ways that surpass your own expectations. The honesty had shifted something in the room's energy. Instead of the usual careful deflections and diplomatic responses, we were finally having a real conversation about the elephant that had been sitting at our family table for years. Aunt Karen had leaned forward, her expression serious. Maya, I need to understand something. When I suggested you consider teaching, was that insulting given what you've already accomplished? The question had touched on something I'd been processing for months. The suggestion itself wasn't insulting, but the underlying assumption, that my current work was insufficient and needed to be replaced with something more stable, had been deeply painful. Teaching is important work, I'd said carefully. But suggesting I should consider it implied that what I was already doing wasn't sustainable or successful. It felt like you'd decided my career was failing without ever really asking about what I was actually accomplishing. Rebecca had put her head in her hands. Maya, I'm horrified. I've been treating you like you were failing when you were actually building exactly the career you wanted. My phone had buzzed again, this time with a call from a number I recognized as my gallery representative. I'd declined the call, but the timing had been perfect for illustrating the point we'd been discussing. That was probably about the inquiry from the collector in Hong Kong, I'd explained. Or the museum in San Francisco that's interested in acquiring one of the pieces from my next series. The casual mention of international collectors and museum acquisitions had seemed to finally drive home the scope of what I'd been building while they worried about my lack of practical career planning. Jessica had been scrolling through more coverage, her teenage enthusiasm undaunted by the adult processing happening around the table. Aunt Maya, this article says you're working on a new series about digital relationships and that there's already a waiting list of collectors who want to purchase pieces before they're even finished. That's amazing. The waiting list was real, and it represented a level of career success I'd never expected to achieve so early. But sitting at the family dinner table, it felt surreal to be discussing these achievements with people who'd spent years encouraging me to consider alternatives to art. Rebecca had looked up from her hands, her expression mixing regret with something approaching pride. Maya, can you help me understand how we got this so wrong? How did we completely miss that you were building a successful career? It was a complex question with roots in family dynamics, communication patterns, and assumptions about what success looked like. But the simple answer was that they'd decided artistic careers were impractical and had interpreted everything I told them through that lens. I think you saw the struggle of building something and assumed that meant it wasn't working, I'd said. Art careers don't follow traditional timelines. There are years of development, skill building, and relationship cultivation before the visible success emerges. From the outside, it probably looked like I was spinning my wheels. Uncle Paul had nodded thoughtfully. And we kept encouraging you to abandon that process in favor of immediate stability. With the best intentions, I'd added, because their concern had always come from love, even when it felt dismissive. The conversation had continued for another hour, with family members asking questions about my work, my process, and my plans that they'd never asked before. It felt like meeting them for the first time as the person I'd actually been for years rather than the person they'd assumed I was. As I'd prepared to leave that evening, Rebecca had pulled me aside for a private conversation. Maya, I need to say something, she'd begun, her voice serious in a way I rarely heard from her. I've spent years believing I was the successful sister and you were the one who needed guidance and support. I realize now that while I was building a traditional career, you were building something much more significant and personally meaningful. The acknowledgement had been profound, not because it changed anything about my work, but because it recognized the different paths to success and fulfillment. Your success doesn't diminish mine, I'd assured her. We just chose different definitions of achievement. She'd hugged me then, and for the first time in years, it had felt like she was hugging the person I actually was rather than the person she thought I should become. Driving home that night, I'd reflected on how strange it felt to finally be seen by my family for who I'd been all along. The validation was meaningful, but it also highlighted how completely they'd misunderstood my life for so long. My phone had been buzzing with messages throughout the evening, from my gallery, from collectors, from art world contacts responding to the exhibition coverage. The professional momentum was building in ways that would have seemed impossible 4 years earlier when I'd started painting in my cramped studio apartment. But perhaps the most significant change wasn't in my career trajectory or public recognition. It was in the family relationships that had been strained by years of misunderstanding. For the first time in years, I felt like I could share my professional achievements without having to defend their validity or practical value. The irony wasn't lost on me that external validation had been necessary before my own family could see value in work I'd been doing successfully for years. But perhaps that's how family dynamics work sometimes. Love and concern can create blindness that only outside perspective can illuminate. As I'd pulled into my apartment complex that night, my phone had rung with a call from Dr. Hartley at the Met. "Maya, I hope I'm not calling too late," she'd said, "but I wanted to discuss the response to your pieces in the Contemporary Visions exhibition. The feedback from critics and collectors has been exceptional, and we'd like to discuss commissioning a new piece specifically for our permanent collection." The conversation had lasted 30 minutes, covering everything from timeline to thematic focus to the significance of having work commissioned specifically for the Met's permanent collection rather than simply acquired. After hanging up, I'd sat in my car for a moment, processing the day's revelations. That morning, I'd been the family member who needed practical career advice. That evening, I was the artist whose work was being commissioned by one of the world's most prestigious museums. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, of course. It had been building for 4 years through countless hours of painting, developing technique, building relationships, and creating work that mattered to me regardless of external recognition. But for the first time in years, my family would see the full picture rather than just the parts that worried them. And perhaps more importantly, I could finally share the work that had been the center of my life with the people who mattered most to me. The studio apartment that had represented failure to my family was actually the place where I'd built exactly the career I'd always wanted. And now finally we all knew it.